We can start now. Everybody has joined.
Right. Wonderful. Excellent. Good evening. Good morning. There are so it's all morning somewhere and evening somewhere, and it's indeed a great occasion. In fact, and I have very fond memories. And I had just completed my training in neurology, and I was at this epilepsy meeting, and the day was over, and we were supposed to go for a social program, and the organizers had arranged a bus, and just seated next to me, there was this gentleman who was a very towering personality, and I realized he was Fred Enderman. The thing that struck me in the bus ride was that he was so friendly. It was as if we were friends since I don't know how long. And that was my first and perhaps only impression of one-to-one talk with Professor Enderman. Of course, I followed him so often in his numerous lectures, his book. I think the first book of his that I read was the book on epilepsy and migraine. And today we have Professor Berkovic and Professor Eva Enderman, the better half of late Frederick Enderman. And both of them have so many mentors around the world. But I think certainly for Professor Berkovic, his Professor Enderman was his mentor. So he's going to be talking about his mentor to his mentees across the world. So it's indeed a great occasion. And complete hats off to Dr. Meshram, who has been organizing this series of wonderful lectures, which I, not only myself, but so many of us have thoroughly enjoyed going back down in the historical lane. And it has been indeed always a very enlightening and an inspiring experience. So I think I would leave the floor to Dr. Meshram. He would not only introduce the subject matter for the day, also introduce the speakers and the chairpersons for the day. So over to you and the other dignitaries in the room. So over to you, Professor Meshram.
Thank you, Dr. Gagandeep. Dear friends, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, bonjour, buenos dias. Tropical and Geographical Neurology Specialty Group of World Federation of Neurology and Indian Academy of Neurology have come together to organize this important series, Inspiring People in Neurosciences. Today, we have the 10th session, and I welcome you all for this. At the outset, on behalf of all, I would like to express our deepest condolences on sad demise of Professor Jun Kimura, who served as a president of WFN from 2002 to 2005, and the WFN achieved great heights under his presidency. We lost an inspiring neurologist and a wonderful human being. Inspirational person today is Professor Frederick Enderman, who is internationally regarded as the last word in clinical epilepsy. He was mentor to many and had friends all over the world. His legacy is carried on at Montreal Neurological Institute and other places in the world. The session about this inspirational person is going to be very special because Professor Samuel Berkovic, the most illustrious student of Fred and wife of Fred, Professor Eva Enderman, will take us through the life and work of Fred and the memories by the chair today, and the invited panelist will be an icing on the cake. To chair this session, we have Professor Jean Gottman. Professor Jean is the professor at the Montreal Neurological Institute, McGill University. Though he is not a neurologist, he had a very long association with Professor Fred, and so a right choice to chair this important session. He received an engineering degree from the University of Paris, a master's degree in computer science from Dartmouth College, and a PhD in neuroscience from McGill University. He pioneered the automatic detection of spikes and seizures during long-term EEG monitoring and made these methods widely available through the Stilett, a company he created in 1986, which developed and sold all over the world equipments and software for EEG, epilepsy monitoring, and polysomnography. He published over 330 peer-reviewed papers and 45 book chapters. His research interests include analysis of the EEG, mechanisms of epileptogenesis, seizure generation and spread in humans, high-frequency oscillations, and functional imaging in the diagnosis and study of epilepsy. Warm welcome, Professor Jean Gottman.
Thank you very much.
In the room, I would also like to welcome invited panelists, Professor Fernando Sendes from Brazil, Professor Antonio Gambardella from Italy, Professor Francois Dubeu from Montreal Neurological Institute, Canada, and due to some technical problems, Professor Prakash Tandon was not able to join today. I would also like to welcome certain distinguished personalities who are present in the room. WFN President, Professor Wolfgang Griswold, WFN Secretary General, Professor Steve Lewis, Tropical and Geographical Neurology Secretary General, Professor Marco Medina, President of Indian Academy of Neurology, Professor Nirmal Surya, past President of Indian Academy of Neurology, Professor J.M. Kimurthy, President-elect, Professor Gagandeep Singh, and we hope that more panelists will join soon. This series is going on extremely well, and there is so much positive feedback from all the participants. All the series lectures are available on the WFN website, and you can listen to the previous 9 sessions anytime. It's a great treat to listen to this, because in this series we learn about legends who have done great work in the field of neurosciences, so that we stimulate the younger generation to do outstanding work in the field of their choice. I'm sure you will enjoy today's session, as the stalwarts will be talking about the stalwart, and it will be a heart-to-heart talk, brain-to-brain talk, and mind-to-mind talk. Before I hand over to Professor Jean, I would like to remind you about the upcoming sessions, about Professor Jerome Posner in April, Professor David G. in May, Professor P.K. Thomas in June. So we have a very upcoming interesting sessions in the lineup. I once again welcome you all, and now hand over to Professor Jean Gottman for further proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meshram, for organizing this series of sessions, and particularly the session today, which is so close to our hearts. I will say just a few words quickly about Dr. Enderman. As you said, I'm not a neurologist, and I was not formally a pupil of Dr. Enderman. But it's a great honor for me to chair this session. And I was training, I'll tell you about the context a little bit in which I interacted with Dr. Enderman. I was trained as in engineering in neuroscience, and I worked on EEG analysis and experimental epilepsy, primarily under the direction of Professor Pierre Glure at the Montreal Neurological Institute. And really at the time when I started, and even for a few years after that, I knew nothing about clinical epilepsy. I knew a bit about EEG and I knew about experimental animal models of epilepsy, but I knew really nothing about clinical epilepsy. But Fred Enderman organized the weekly seizure conference, and I'm sure you will hear more about it from others. But I thought this was my chance to hear a little bit about and to actually see patients, because I never saw patients. And so I went regularly to the seizure conference. And it became an incredible source of learning because of the way Fred ran them. The cases were presented in great detail. Fred listened to everyone very attentively, to all the presenters, and of course, listened to the patient and to the family very, very attentively, and questioned with very insightful and probing questions the patients and the family repeatedly and repeatedly. And I thought sometimes, why is he asking these questions so many times? But eventually he got the answers he wanted. And it was really because of his patience and his insistence, and of course the very careful questions he was asking. Then at the end of the presentation, he would ask the junior physicians to make their assessment. And I'm sure Dr. Sandez and Dr. Debo and Dr. Gambardella remember these times because they had to say something. And for me, it was wonderful to hear these young people thinking and explaining what they were thinking. And then finally, he asked the more senior ones to give their advice. And this was kind of the crowning of the session, because that was the truth. And of course, it ended with Dr. Enderman giving his final words. This is an incredibly effective teaching method, and Fred was fully invested in it, taking all the time necessary and leaving no stone unturned. My career would have been completely different without this rich teaching, because I was able to actually, even though my background was not clinical, to do research that was related to clinical epilepsy, almost exclusively because of these conferences and because of the way Fred was teaching. This is just one example of how Fred was generous of his time and of his knowledge, showing respect and personal warmth to everyone: researchers, students, residents, nurses, technicians, colleagues, and of course, patients. So for me, it has been a life-changing experience, even though, as I said, I was not directly involved in being Fred's student. And I'm eternally grateful to Fred for the generosity of his time and for his friendship, because of course, he also was a friend of our family and of our children, and knowing everybody and knowing all our pets and our birds and our dogs, and always asking about them as well. So about now, I will, I was going to say I will introduce Dr. Eva Enderman, but of course, I don't need to introduce Dr. Eva Enderman, but I will say a few words. I guess I have to share my screen, or will you? Could you show the CV of Dr. Eva Enderman?
Yeah, it is in display. It is displayed.
I'm sorry?
Yeah,
Jean, I think the order is I speak and then Eva was going to follow.
we can see the CV.
Okay, I'm sorry. One second. So Dr. Berkovic was trained at the University of Melbourne. He was a fellow under Fred Enderman. This is when we met, of course, at the time, and frequently talked when Sam was in Montreal. Then he returned to Melbourne, where he became director of the Epilepsy Research Center, director of the epilepsy program. He has published more than 650 papers on epilepsy, especially, of course, on the genetics of epilepsy. This is mind-boggling. The number is mind-boggling, but maybe what is more, when you see these papers on epilepsy, on genetics of epilepsy, there's always 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 authors. And you can imagine that, well, it's not so difficult to be an author on a paper on genetics of epilepsy. The difference, of course, with Sam is that on many of these papers, he's the senior author. And so this is absolutely an extraordinary achievement. For these achievements, he received many major awards, in 1995 the Epilepsy Research Recognition Award of the American Epilepsy Society, which is the highest distinction of the American Epilepsy Society. In 2005, he became fellow of the Australian Academy of Science. Then he got the Zulz Prize for Basic Neurological Research for the Max Planck Society in Germany. In 2007, fellow of the Royal Society, which is an extremely high achievement. Companion of the Order of Australia. Prime Minister's Prize for Science, together with his pupil, Professor Ingrid Schaefer, who considers herself a grandchild of Fred Enderman in this hierarchy. The Srinivasan Endowment Prize and Oration and Chennai in India. And finally, more recently, international member of the National Academy of Medicine in the USA. So it's really hard to top this. And it's really a great pleasure for me to ask Sam to talk to us about Fred Enderman. Please, Sam.
Thank you very much, Jean. Can I just confirm you can see my slides now?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you, Jean, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Dr. Mishram, the WFN, the Indian Academy of Neurology, for inviting me to give this talk. It's really an enormous pleasure to provide this tribute to a really inspirational neurologist who, as has been said, was my mentor in 1984 to 87. It was an amazing period for me. It really opened up my eyes as to how clinical science and clinical research should be done. And it's also a special privilege to present together with Dr. Eva Enderman, from whom I also learnt an enormous amount and really gave me my start in genetics. Fred was a remarkable man, and his warm personality to everybody, from the cleaners to the senior neurologists and certainly the patients, has already been mentioned. And this picture to me captures his sort of enduring and warm personality. Eva and Fred were a remarkable partnership. Here you see them looking at a poster of one of the numerous genetic disorders that they described or refined, particularly amongst in the rural areas of Quebec, where there was a lot of consanguinity. And their field trips, where they went out to see the patients directly and construct the family histories, and Fred would examine the patients in enormous detail, was a real eye-opener to me to see how clinical research, and in particular clinical genetic research, should be done. And that was one of the highlights of my training there. Eva will talk more about the personal and family aspects of Fred, but I just want to say just a couple of words about his origins, because I think this is important, and Eva may expand on this. He was born in 1930 in a place called Czernowitz in central Romania, in what was called the Bukovina. He was Jewish, of course, and he was a Holocaust survivor. Czernowitz was a center of Jewish learning for many centuries before, but Fred and his family had to flee in the Holocaust, and his family were refugees in Vienna and Paris. So he didn't kind of have a silver spoon sort of upbringing nor was he brought up in a family of neurologists or doctors. His beginnings were extremely modest, and he rose to the top by his brilliance and hard work in difficult circumstances. The family came to Montreal in 1950. He did his medical degree at the University of Montreal, and then his neurological training at McGill University. And he remained at McGill through the Montreal Neurological Institute and the Montreal Children's Hospital throughout his whole career. His mentors were Francis McNaughton and Preston Robb. who he always spoke incredibly highly of, and they were indeed fine neurologists and made important contributions, but it was very clear to me that Fred's ability and achievements far outshone them. He was also strongly influenced by the neurosurgical tradition of Wilder Penfield, who of course established the Montreal Neurological Institute, and of Theodore Ted Rasmussen, with whom Fred worked for very many years, and was a remarkable partnership early on, and subsequently with Andre Olivier. And he remained at McGill throughout his whole professional life, eventually becoming Professor Emeritus. Now, his list of contributions is enormous, and there's a second slide for this, but I just thought it was worth spending a little bit of time to, in terms of an inspirational person, to understand the sort of the breadth of his scholarship and knowledge. He was incredibly interested in clinical phenomena, and particularly things that could be extracted from the history. Dr. Singh's already mentioned his book on migraine and epilepsy, and he was fascinated by this relationship and made some important, insightful observations. He was also interested in things that are really hard to define and hard to study, like hallucinatory phenomena, which he wrote on, and also movement disorders and epilepsy, and he wrote one of the definitive papers on startle disorders. He clarified a number of incredibly complex neurological disorders, some of which I'll touch on in more detail, but this sort of just shows the extent of his interests and contributions in the mitochondrial disorders, in familial hemiplegic migraine, in progressive myoclonus epilepsies, in malformations of cortical development. Everyone's heard of Joubert syndrome. What you might not know is that Dr. Enderman is the last author on that paper, and Dr. Joubert was his resident at the time. So it was really Fred who sort of put that one together. He was very interested in chronic encephalitis, or Rasmussen's encephalitis as it's known, and wrote a definitive book on that. He was also fascinated by the remarkable disorder of hypothalamic hamartoma and epilepsy, which I'll discuss, as well as in storage disorders, which he wrote extensively on familial epilepsies and a number of other rare disorders. And it's important to mention Enderman syndrome, not an epilepsy, but this is agenesis of the corpus callosum with lower motor neurone signs, which is a recessive disorder described in Quebec. He was also interested in big picture issues in epilepsy. He was one of the, following really Penfield and Rasmussen, one of the really strong proponents of surgical treatment of epilepsy, which was not popular amongst in many neurological centres, and many neurologists of his generation simply didn't believe in surgical treatment of epilepsy, but he was one that sort of carried the flag and did it extremely effectively. He was very quick to take on new and effective technologies, particularly imaging, which I'll mention later, and also had a deep interest in genetics together with Eva, and they made some important discoveries together there. So that's really a very broad palette, and it's also not complete, but it just gives you a feel for the breadths of this wonderful man's scholarship. He was a master clinician, and he really reveled in the art of the clinical history. Many neurologists, and particularly academic neurologists, they kind of see ward rounds as something to get over and get on with, and don't spend a lot of time and rely on their junior staff to get the history. Fred really enjoyed taking the history, and you've already heard from Dr. Gottman about how good he was at it. And it made all the difference and was really the cornerstone of his neurological inquiry and how it all worked. One thing I observed very early on, he took his time, and he showed that he took his time. He would often sit down, which I wondered about initially, but it's clearly a way of showing the patient and the family that he's interested, and he takes time. And it was always a lengthy but impressive performance to watch Fred dissect through a history. And the way he did it at the seizure conferences has also been mentioned by Jean, and this is something that was really special in the way Fred did it. He had enormous empathy for patients. There was no sense of aloofness. He made patients and families from whatever background feel welcome, and that he was genuine and interested in them, which he genuinely was. And I'm sure this was a major factor in his success as a neurological clinician. He had an insatiable clinical curiosity. Sometimes when clinicians encounter phenomena that they don't understand or have not heard of, they just put it to the side, and they're just working within the paradigm of the diagnostic framework that they've learnt. And we all put people into boxes as we make diagnosis. Fred wasn't like that. His mind was always open, and if there was something odd, he'd chase it, and he'd keep chasing it till he figured out what it was. And that was something really impressive to watch as a clinical researcher. He had a remarkable memory for patients, for their names, for what they did, and of course for their clinical features. And this allowed him to put together series of rare disorders of patients that he might have seen very many years ago, but pull them out of his mind and put them together to then elucidate that disorder. And the other thing that I find hard to describe but was really remarkable was what I've called parallel processing of clinical patterns, where he would take a history and do the examination, and things would look funny and didn't make any sense, but Fred had a way of kind of putting this together so that the final story ultimately clicked. And this was really quite remarkable to watch. So let me illustrate some of those points by some of the work he did. And I'm going to first talk about the mitochondrial encephalopathies, a work that I wasn't involved with personally initially, but Fred was very involved with when I came to Montreal in '84. These disorders now are, of course, very well known, and they're largely solved by molecular genetic techniques. But at that time, they were a very fuzzy and heterogeneous group of disorders. Their hallmark was the ragged red fibre, a pathological hallmark, and this was the way in to understand them, and we didn't have the molecular genetic techniques available then. And Fred was interested in these disorders, particularly those with seizures, and he pulled out common themes and was able to put it together. This was especially so in the area of migraine and MELAS, mitochondrial encephalomyopathy, lactic acidosis, and stroke-like episodes. This disorder was very interesting in the way it evolved. It was first probably initially described by neurologists with an interest in neuromuscular disease, and some of the patients they described had quite severe myopathy, sometimes associated neuropathy. They were often short and deaf, and yes, they had seizures, but this wasn't sort of much of not made much of at the time. Fred was, of course, seeing people with bad epilepsy, and he saw this group of patients with a very odd clinical pattern that he started to put together. And I'll describe that a bit more in a moment. Also, he became interested in the progressive myoclonus epilepsies, and particularly the mitochondrial form of that, MRF, or myoclonus epilepsy with ragged red fibres, and separated that from Unruh-Lundborg disease, as I'll discuss in a moment. And he was able to put together the story with complex phenotypes within families. And this was really a remarkable achievement in terms of this sort of parallel processing and pulling facts out. The MELAS story, as I've said, initially came out of the neuromuscular school of neurology, but Fred, together with his counterpart Elio Lugarese in Bologna, saw these patients with migrainous and epileptic features that were really quite unusual. And they had these catastrophic events, which stroke-like episodes were recognised by others, but they had partial or generalised seizures culminating in epilepsia partialis continua. And the bottom paragraph I've put in italics. This is pure Fred. It's clear to me that he wrote this. This is the way he thought, this sort of relatively unusual pattern in a context of a history and a positive family history of migraine. There were prolonged migrainous events should raise suspicion of disorder when no other clearly established cause for epilepsy can be found. And I can remember him puzzling over these patients, and he'd remember this pair of brothers from Cuba that he saw once, and this other patient from the southern United States, and a few others from Canada. And he could kind of see that they were the same, and then eventually they all pulled together, and this led to the sort of understanding of this very unusual epileptic phenomenon in MELAS, which I think, all neurologists or all epilepsy specialists now recognise well and have seen. But it was Fred's unusual clinical skills and his devotion to picking out the story that pulled this together. Similarly, the PMEs, or progressive myoclonus epilepsies, in the early 80s, there was no real way to make a specific diagnosis in the majority of these cases. It was known that they were familial, that these patients had myoclonic seizures, tonic-clonic seizures, and then had progressive neurological decline. The pathologists broadly classified these into what was called degenerative, where at post-mortem there was loss of neurons, particularly in the cerebellum, sometimes in the inferior olive, and variable degeneration in the cortex. There was Lafora disease that had its specific Lafora bodies described in 1911 by Gonzalo Lafora, and there were a bunch of patients with lipid storage diseases. And Fred saw a lot of these patients because he and Montreal colleagues were known for it, and it was a remarkable environment. There was this large referral base. There was a lot of Canadian experience with ceroid lipofuscinosis because of the cases in Newfoundland, and there was an increased frequency of recessive disorders, particularly in the rural Quebec population, where consanguinity was relatively common. And there was, before the molecular genetic era, there was this expertise in Montreal, Sterling Carpenter and George Carpati in pathology, Leon Wolfe in neurochemistry, Eva in neurogenetics, and Fred with his remarkable clinical eye. And I remember first seeing this before I went to Montreal, because in 1981, Fred visited Melbourne. My mentor in Melbourne, Peter Bladen, who really got epilepsy going in Australia, had found in Fred a sort of a strong common soul, really, and invited Fred to Australia to help us get surgical treatment going, etc. And we showed Fred a few patients, and there was a patient with progressive myoclonus epilepsy. It was clear to me that Peter Bladen, who was a very, very good neurologist, sort of had no idea what the cause of this was. And Fred said straight away, this man's got Unruh-Lundborg disease. And I thought, oh, how did he know that? And we obviously had no way of proving it. This was well before the genetic cause of this was found, but I stored this in my head. And in fact, years later, we proved it molecularly. But this was my first sort of encounter with Fred. And then when I went to Montreal, he gave me a project to try and sort out the Montreal series. And together, really Fred was able to identify some of the characteristic clinical patterns. He kind of knew what Unruh-Lundborg disease was. I think he'd seen a few patients in Finland, and he sort of understood what the specific phenotype was and could pick this out. The mitochondrial disorders, MRF, was just coming on the scene, and we had a large family with that and a number of other cases. And we began dissecting the fact that we could pull out the difference between Unruh-Lundborg disease and MRF by appropriate testing. The lipidoses were getting sorted out, and with various biopsy techniques pioneered by Sterling Carpenter and George Carpati, and biochemical analyses, one could start to diagnose many of these disorders in life before the molecular genetic revolution, and also recognizing that there were particular demographic patterns that were helpful, and then eventually the genes appeared. So in the middle of the 80s, the degenerative disorders turned into Unruh-Lundborg disease and MRF, and we had quite a number of cases of MRF, and I'll show you an interesting example of that. Lafora disease was diagnosed by the characteristic Lafora bodies, and the lipidoses were gradually getting sorted out. Here is a key family that kind of showed me how Fred could pull all this together. This family has MRF, which we diagnosed at the time and later shown to have the common MRF mutation, but that wasn't known yet. And the patient shown here, or the pathology sample shown here, the brainstem, shows the features of Lee's disease. You can see these two necrotic areas in the colliculi, and this was this patient here who died in his first decade. His actual cousin developed later onset myoclonic epilepsy, and she's shown here, and she has these characteristic lipomas, which we then showed were a mitochondrial phenomenon. So there were these quite diverse clinical manifestations, from a Lee-like syndrome to a milder progressive myoclonic ataxia with characteristic lipomas that all came together and with maternal inheritance. And Fred had a way of sort of knowing that this was sort of right. Somebody else or many others would have said, no, none of this fits together. This is all coincidental, but it all kind of, it was right. And Fred was able to see that this clicked together. Exactly how, I'm not sure. And then by the year 2000, many of the genes were starting to fall out, and this list is now very incomplete. There's well over about 30 genes now for PME, but that's a story for another day. But the point I want to make here is that it was sort of Fred's genius that allowed his enormous clinical insight to put things together in these rare and very complex disorders. Another phenomenon is how to know when something's new. And Fred had this way of really this authoritative recognition of novel phenomenon. We're all comfortable as clinicians diagnosing things we've seen before, and we get excited diagnosing things that we've seen written before, but to put it together for the first time and sort of be pretty certain that this is the story is not easy. And Fred had a great way of doing this. And the one disorder that I got involved with him was hypothalamic hamartoma. And this was our original patient in Montreal, initially a neuroencephalogram done well before modern neuroimaging, and then a grainy, very early MRI scan showing this lesion at the bottom of the hypothalamus, displacing the third ventricle, which you can see here in the old style neuroencephalogram. But it was only as the MRIs got better that we began to be able to confidently recognize these things. And here's another example. And this is now an extremely well-studied disorder. But it's got bizarre clinical features, and Fred sort of put this together. They have laughing seizures from the neonatal period. And again, Fred didn't discover this, but he learnt that this was really an important marker for this disorder. They then have an evolution of seizure patterns from this apparently benign phenomenon to a nasty generalized epilepsy, really being a form of Lennox-Gastaut syndrome with refractory epilepsy. They could have both focal and generalized seizures. Some of them went on to have unsuccessful temporal lobectomies, and they get a nasty encephalopathy. But interestingly, they also had rage attacks, and some of these were really spectacular, explosive bouts of rage. And normally in neurology, when we see this, we kind of say, oh, that's all psychiatric and, you know, it's probably environmental. Fred saw that this wasn't, that this was sort of a fundamental part of the disorder, of hypothalamic rage, so to speak. And they also had precocious puberty. And we put this together in 1988 to really define the syndrome. And that sort of description has held up pretty well, and there's continuing great interest in this disorder. The next thing I want to mention is not the clinical aspects itself, but the ability to judge the significance of clinical investigations. Fred knew the value of pathology and knew the value of biochemistry, and he was quick to take on new forms of investigation. And the Montreal Neurologic Institute had the sort of facilities to get the newest, the first, and imaging as it came in, initially with CT scanning and then with MRI and PET scanning. The neuro always got this very early, and Fred was able to understand how these investigations could be used. And importantly, he was able to synthesize what was important and not peripheral. Sometimes as clinicians, we get a result and it's sort of presented as important and clear, and it may in fact end up being peripheral. And it may also be dependent on the interpretation of the person writing the report or preparing the report. And he had a favourite phrase relevant to pathology, but also to imaging. When the findings were subtle, he would sort of say, "Is this up the microscope or down the microscope?" In other words, is this something that the person looking at the slide is actually creating in his or her mind, or over-interpreting, or is it really there? And this was a wonderful phrase, and it really made the pathologist or the imaging, the radiologist, really made them think about whether this was right or not. And Fred had a way of sort of knowing how it did or did not fit in with the clinical picture. He also pushed his colleagues to take investigations further. Some neurologists will use MRI by looking at their reports and usually looking at the films. One thing I learned from Fred is that he always went to speak to the radiologist directly and look at the images with the radiologist and push them and took it further. And this was a great lesson to me. He took time to go over the investigations, and one always got much more out of it. One of the sort of really great moments for me in my time with Fred, when we were starting to look at MRI images. These are grainy 1986 spin echo images, but we're actually able to see hippocampal sclerosis, which of course is standard fodder now. Everybody can do this. But what the younger people may not know is that in the 1980s, most radiologists, and certainly all neurologists, wouldn't have known where the hippocampus was. They knew the name because it's a cute name, but to actually show on an image where it was, they mostly wouldn't have known because it was actually poorly shown on CAT scans. But when Fred sort of saw this, he got really excited, and he knew that this was something important, and was able to really put that into perspective. Next, I want to turn to his sort of inspiration as a mentor. As Dr. Singh mentioned at the first time he met Fred on the bus, he just exudes this personal warmth. And Jean has mentioned as well, he's got a deep interest in people and their origins and great respect for everybody. And the way he handled people, his people skills were absolutely remarkable. And that reflected on his the way he dealt with patients. It also reflected on the way he dealt with his colleagues and particularly his students, of which he had many from all over the world, and he always took an interest in them, always helped them with their issues, and was very generous with his time in terms of teaching and mentoring him. And many students came from all parts of the world, some without good English skills, and he would spend a lot of time helping them. I was in Montreal for about 4 weeks, and we were very quickly invited up to the farm in Mansonville, and this is one of my favourite pictures. This cow is Daisy, which was one of Fred's favourites, and on the front of the cow is his youngest child, Mark, who we'll return to at the moment. And then there are 2 of my children, and here is Annie. And Fred took us very quickly into his family. He helped us enormously, and was just incredibly incredibly generous with his time. And no one can actually express this better than Mark, who I just showed you sitting on the front of the cow. So this is a quote from Mark is now a Harvard neuroscientist who's publishing regularly in the highest impact neuroscience journals. And he wrote this together with a number of others in a memoriam for Fred in Annals of Neurology in 2019. And I just thought this was lovely and really captures Fred's very unique approach to his colleagues, that he and his sisters thought it was usual to have guest speakers sleep at their house on a monthly basis. He thought it was usual to invite them regularly out to restaurants and to have numerous people at their country cottage for the weekend. And that's kind of is an insider's view of how it was in the Enderman household. And I just thought this was a lovely quote that I couldn't capture any better. So he's got this genuine warmth, and the mentoring continues long beyond the fellowship. For individuals, he remains very interested in you through your career, and I had a wonderful relationship with Fred and Eva, continuing with Eva, but to Fred until his passing. He was very, very supportive and always interested in me and my family. And I see that in all the other people that he mentors. And, you know, we were his academic children. And even as has already been mentioned, many of the mentees of his children really see themselves as his academic grandchildren. They may not have worked with him directly, but they've certainly, they would have met him, but they kind of get this feel that they're immediately welcomed into his circle. And this was a remarkable trait, and one that sort of endeared him to all of us. And he had a great ability to synthesize collaborations locally and internationally, just by his warm personality and the force of his intellect and of his personality. And this was sort of 5 years after I'd returned back to Melbourne. Eva and Fred were visiting us, and these are sort of some of his academic grandchildren, some of whom will be very well known to you. Ingrid Sheffer, who is made an enormous impact on epileptic encephalopathy. Simon Harvey, who has done some amazing things in child neurology, particularly surgery. David Rootens, who was another distinguished alumnus of Fred. He was a child and a grandchild in some ways. So this mentorship just continues on. And the front is Mark Newton, who's done some wonderful work and was also close to Fred through me. So to wrap it up, some of the extra pearls I learned from Fred, it's all in the history. Fred didn't invent that, but he really showed it to me and kept going back to it. And no matter how slick the technology is, he would still go back and talk to the patient and the family in great detail and have the long discussions at seizure conference. He showed patience, time and patience with patience and time with the patients and families, and the seizure conference has been mentioned already. Another thing I learned from him, that as a young neurologist who sort of thought he knew everything, I didn't fully understand right away. So we would do a ward round and we'd go up to a patient in the ward at the neuro, and it was clear that the doctors who'd been treating this patient had completely messed it up, that they'd got the diagnosis wrong, the wrong medication. And the first thing Fred would say would be, "You've been very well treated." And then the patient would say, "But Dr. Enderman, my previous doctor didn't do all the things that you've done." And Fred would say, "You've been very well treated." And he had this penchant for doing this. And of course, this was to help the patient, or allow the patient to sort of keep the trust in the original treating doctor. And I see that as a very unusual trait and a very good one. As the litigation situation has changed around the world, this might not be a strategy that will work so well anymore, but it was a wonderful way that Fred built up the link between the patient, his neurologist in their hometown, and him. And it was a very good device. I've already mentioned his enormous skill with putting investigation into perspective, up the microscope or down the microscope. Another thing he emphasised was that when we all thought we might have discovered something, he had this wonderful saying, "Everything has been written, but not everything has been read." Now, of course, there are novel things to discover, but he made the point that there is a lot in the literature, and you go looking for it, and often you can find things that are relevant to the unusual phenomenon that you've observed. English was far from his first language. I'm not sure what number language it was, probably about his fourth. But he was an amazing writer. And the other aphorism I remember was he would berate us to write clearly, and he said that so that the Kansas City milkman could understand what we're writing, and that's a good thing to remember. So to sum up, why was he inspirational? Well, he was a remarkably gifted clinician. He had an amazing clinical eye. He could synthesize diverse data from multiple patients, and he knew what was new. And that's something really special, I think, to know when you're onto something. He had amazing devotion and empathy to patients. He was incredibly down to earth with no aloofness. He attracted and mentored innumerable students, and he genuinely cared for and supported his students. And you know, that's to me why he was inspirational in many aspects. Here's a famous painting of the traditional old style doctor. And you see Fred on the side here. This is him during a visit to Melbourne when we had him interviewing a patient. This wasn't a seizure conference, it was teaching. But you can just see, even though it's on the side, Fred's warmth towards this kid, his interest in the kid and the family. And that's how he operated, and it was extremely effective. And what a wonderful clinician and clinician researcher he was. So with that, I'll finish. And again, thank you for listening to me. And I'm eager to hear Eva's comments from the more personal and family side.
Thank you, Sam, for the wonderful expose of Fred, about Fred. And it's so, I mean, I know all these things, but it's wonderful to hear them and said them so well and put together all these aspects, which is, again, point to an absolutely remarkable personality. So now we will move to Dr. Eva Enderman. And I think I will share my screen and or you will show. Okay, thank you. Eva Enderman, it's again a funny thing to do to introduce Eva Enderman to this audience, but I think we can say a few facts about Eva, who was born in Poland in 1939 and came to Canada not to about the same time roughly as Fred came to Canada. Eva majored in mathematics and physics, which I think many people don't realize, 1959, then got her MD degree and a master's in genetics and then a PhD in biology, all at McGill University. Obtained her medical training in medical genetics in EEG and clinical neurophysiology at McGill, and particularly at the Montreal Neurological Institute. And I'll say a few words about that because we hear very often these days that it's very important for people to move around and go learn here and go learn there and go to different places. In order to have a good career, you have to move around. And I think that you can see with both Fred and Eva, who did not only their career, but their training and their whole life in the same place. And obviously it didn't stop them from fantastic achievements. So there may be some truth in going around places, but I don't think it's a requirement. Eva was appointed as a neurogeneticist and clinical electroencephalographer in 1973. She founded and directed, of course, the neurogenetics unit at the MNI starting in 1973, which is a long time ago when there were not so many such units. And currently, of course, she's professor in the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery and in human genetics at McGill. Her main research has been, of course, in the genetics of the epilepsies, genetics of malformation of cortical development, genetics of ataxias, progressive myoclonic epilepsies, and many other neurological diseases. She's worked a lot in epilepsy and pregnancy, teratogenic effects of anti-seizure medications, again, at a time when this was not so common. She's a co-founder and chairperson and was chairperson of the Neurogenetics Research Group of the World Federation of Neurology, started again in the very early days, member and advisor of the Genetics Commission of the International League Against Epilepsy. And yes, thank you. And Eva has received an incredible number of honors and awards. Maybe one of the most important is Governor General of Canada's Medal, 125th anniversary of Canadian Confederation, honorary member of the Spanish Epilepsy Society, McGill Quarter Century Club. I'm sure they have a half-century club and more than that, and Eva would be member, I'm sure, for already quite a while. Honorary member of several societies, and I won't read all of the prizes here, but maybe mention a few. Ambassador Award, which is the highest distinction, the International League Against Epilepsy, and Lifetime Achievement Award for from McGill University. And of course, we organized many years ago with Dr. Dubois the symposium Epilepsy at the Cutting Edge, a symposium in honor of both Fred and Eva. That was in 2008. And she earned a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Montreal Neurological Institute. So this is just a small list, a small summary. It seems to be hard to summarize all Eva's achievements in 2 slides, but please, Eva.
Thank you very much, Jean. And I really enjoyed listening to Sam and the way that he can summarize everything and put it all there. And it's really fantastic. So if you could put on my slides, please.
So, okay. Am I allowed to share the screen? So can
Thank
you see the slides?
I want to thank Jean because my technical abilities in this are not yet fully developed. So without him, I don't know what I would do. First of all, Sam has already talked a lot about the work that we have done together, and I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I wanted to say that Fred, I'm going to deal more with family, friends, fellows, colleagues, and the relationship to mentors and patients. And then there's the other part, which I was asked to talk about, and that is his hobbies and which are mainly the farm, which I will show, and his interest in food and in animals, furry friends, as he called them, and of course his children and grandchildren who were his biggest interest. So, and next, please.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you see the slides full screen normally? Everybody? Okay.
No.
No, they're not full screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Anyway, go ahead. I will try to.
Right. So first of all, on the left here, you see Fred's father, who served as a quartermaster in the Austrian army because he was more educated than most of the soldiers. Now, the place where he was born, Czernowitz, changed countries 8 times between the First World War and now. And now it's actually in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, but it's been under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, under Romania, Russia, and back and forth over the years. On the right, the slide is not on. On the right,
Can you see the slides now?
No, sir.
So you would have to share the screen again.
Yeah. Yes. Can you put it on a slideshow?
Yes.
Okay. Next, please. Sorry. So on the right, you see Fred at the age of perhaps 13 or 14, and the lady in the back holding a little boy is his mother. And these are orphans, war orphans, which she helped to save from Transnistria, where their parents were killed or starved. And most of these were Jewish children, and they were sent to Palestine. And there is a book now about this, and this picture is on the cover, and there's a chapter about her work in helping with these orphans. Next, please. And Fred was very proud of this. And since I'm a geneticist, I put this in. This is the pedigree of Fred's family, which was made by his cousin who lived in Israel. And here you see Lisa, Annie, and Mark, our children. And his father was one of 6 children. And a lot of these people in this very large family did not survive the Second World War. And the ones who did largely went to Palestine, which became Israel. And especially the lady on the right who had 5 children, and she now has numerous descendants. We once were at a reception where there were 80 people from his family alone. So next, please. Right. On the left is a picture of Fred when he was starting high school. On the right, they used to climb mountains in the Carpathian Mountains, and this was right after his final school examination, high school examinations. Next. On the left is his. So they left Romania in 1949 and made their way to the West. This was difficult in communist countries. It was very hard to get out. And they stopped in Vienna, and every place they stopped, Fred registered in a university, but he didn't stay very long, just a few weeks. And then they went off to Paris, where he went to the Sorbonne, and in a flight of enthusiasm, he enrolled in several faculties at the same time, and then only later realized that he couldn't do all of these courses. That was impossible. And they spent about 1.5 years in Paris and arrived in Canada in 1950. He was accepted at McGill to finish his undergraduate degree in 2 years, and then applied for medical school. At that time, it was difficult to get into McGill medicine. There was still a Jewish quota, and Fred at the time had to help his family get established in their business, which was an import business. And his father was quite ill and died a few years later. So Fred was a traveling salesman going all over Canada on any school holiday. He would be traveling and selling scissors and musical instruments and so on. So his marks were not quite that good. So he got accepted in the French University, Université de Montréal, and this is where he did his medical school. And next, please. And then he came back to McGill and did his neurology training, as you've heard, with Drs. Francis McNaughton and Preston Robb. And this is in 1965, they used to take a picture like this every year at the Neuro. And in 1965, and you see some of the famous staff, the lady in the middle, that's Brenda Milner, and below her is in the middle is Dr. Penfield, and on the man in the suit on the right is Dr. McNaughton. And a few months after this, next please. a few months after he became on staff, we were married. And I just tell you that the way that we met was when I was 18. I had my parents, who were both physicians, had to repeat all their medical training, and my father was at that time the chief resident in psychiatry at McGill, and Fred decided to take an elective in psychiatry. So they were working together, and that's how we met. But we only married 7 years later, because I still had to do medical school, and then we married after that. So on the left are my parents, on the right are Fred's mother and aunt, because his father had already died. Next. And soon after this, so when we got married, I had just started doing my PhD with Dr. Julius and Catherine Mitrakis, who were pioneers in genetics of epilepsy, and here this was in the early days when I was on staff, and we started doing these field trips to regions of Quebec where there was founder effect, a very small original population of about 80 people, which now numbered 300,000. So everybody you met there, if you were from this region, would be related, perhaps an average of second-degree cousin once removed. So there were a lot of recessive diseases to study there, and here the first one we studied was Tay-Sachs disease in French Canadians. As you know, Tay-Sachs disease was usually seen in Ashkenazi Jews, and it was a question of how did it get here, and that was one of the first things that we looked at. Then we found this agenesis of the corpus callosum with sensory motor neuropathy, and it was the same thing. We were able to trace the ancestors back to the 17th century when they arrived from France. And this was very interesting work. We would go on these field trips, which Sam mentioned, and it was really very interesting. We would see perhaps 200 people, and in Tay-Sachs disease, although the gene was not known, one could detect the carriers. So we did a very large screening program of about 2,500 people, and in the region, and this was really very exciting work at the time. Next, please. Right. So a couple of years after we were married, our oldest daughter, Lisa, was born, and then our second daughter, Annie, who was the baby in this picture. So we bought a house, and Kay Mitrakis, who was who had started the EG laboratory at the Montreal Children's Hospital, which is now dedicated to her, and was the wife of Julius Mitrakis, who was my thesis supervisor. she had always said that first you get your PhD, then you buy a house, then you have a baby. But we did it sort of in reverse order. I did get the PhD, but we got the babies before we bought the house. Okay, next. And all of our children, Lisa on the left, Annie on the right, next. And the youngest, Mark, they enjoyed being on horses from a very young age. And Fred was interested in these Norwegian fjord horses. And here on the right, we went on a trip to the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region of Quebec. And this is the region which I was talking about, where there is a lot of founder effect. And we had already seen a few of the patients with agenesis of the corpus callosum, with the familial agenesis. And we stopped in a hospital which is run by nuns, and we asked if by any chance there were any, because they originated from this region, we asked if they had seen any patients. And in 5 minutes, they brought out 3 siblings. I don't have the picture here. 3 siblings, you know, and they all had exactly the same clinical picture. They brought them out in wheelchairs. And by the end of that weekend, I had been in several farmhouses taking family histories, and we had found 45 patients, either living or not, who were affected with this condition. Interestingly, the neurologists who were taking care of them were not aware that there was such a huge number, and were not really aware of the conditions. Next, please. And here, this picture, Fred was, as Sam said, also working at the Montreal Children's Hospital. And here he is on the left, next to Gordon Waters, who was at that time chief of neurology at the Children's. And on the right, at Marie Joubert, who after whom the Joubert syndrome is named, and who was a resident at the time. The lady in black in the back is Kay Matrakis, the chief of the EEG lab, and the other lady, the blonde one, is Angelika Hecker from Germany, who was a fellow at the time. And to her left is Pierre Langevin, a prominent child neurologist here in Quebec. Next, please. Okay, now on the left, you see our 3 children. Mark was very small. The girl in the back is the Matrakis' daughter, Stephanie, who is also a physician. And Fred had, not only did he have the Norwegian fjord horses, which we still have, but he had the cows. He had a whole herd of cows, Hereford cattle, and here you see Sam and his daughter again with with the cow. Next, please. And since this is the Indian Academy of Neurology, I just wanted to tell you about our first trip to India, which was in 1989, when all of the big meetings, the World Federation of Neurology, the ILAE, and the International Clinical Neurophysiology meetings were all held in Delhi that year. Some of you may remember. And so we came and did the usual tourist things. Next. Ending up in the Taj. Next. But we also visited friends, mainly who had trained at the Neuro. And here we are with Desh Gulati in Chandigarh, the late Desh Gulati, and then he had established a neurology clinic and the EEG lab there. Next. And then we came back to Delhi for 2 weeks of meetings. And here we are at the home of Prakash Tandon and his wife Leela. And with Prakash's mentor from Norway, Dr. Christiansen, who's a neurosurgeon there and who influenced him to come to the Neuro. Now, Prakash Tandon was a very good friend of Fred's. They trained together, and they arranged for us to stay with a very nice family in New Delhi, and we kept up our contact with this family for many years. Next. Here you see on the left, Lisa graduating from medical school, and I have to say that she was very much, she was doing some medical anthropology work, but hadn't decided to do medicine. And when she came on the trip with us to India and visited some hospitals there, she decided that that's what she wants to do, and here she is. And on the right, we were at the International Epilepsy meeting in Dublin in 1997, and at that time, both of our daughters, Lisa next to Fred and Annie next to her, were also giving papers at this meeting. So all four of us were participating. And on the left, next to me is Linda Dansky, who was my first graduate student who did both a master's and PhD with me, and Daniela D'Agostino on the very left, who is now a medical geneticist. Next. And finally, we have child is now married, and we are blessed with 6 grandchildren. And here's Fred with 3 of them. Next. And this is our whole family. around 2014 in the country, and this is where we meet because we all live in different places, in Toronto, in Montreal, and in Boston. Next. And I forgot to say that both of our daughters are physicians, and Lisa is a psychiatrist who's doing transcultural psychiatry, and Annie is in public health and is doing global public health research. And Mark, as you've heard, is a professor in neuroscience at Harvard. So here, Fred had got one of the awards, which is actually called the Walter Penfield Award in Quebec. And here's Farmer Fred. And on the right, he's officiating at the Jewish New Year in Montreal. And this was our 50th wedding anniversary in 2015. Next. Here's Fred and Mark in the kitchen of our country house. Next. And this is a picture that was shown in a wonderful obituary that Günther Kramer wrote, and he organized a meeting in Sils Maria in Switzerland, in a very intimate sort of country house, chalet, which actually had been visited by Anne Frank. Most of you know about her, and this was really one of the best epilepsy meetings that we had attended. Thank you. Ed, just a moment. Next, please. Now, here's Fred visiting Lisa, our oldest daughter, goes up north to Baffin Island 3 times a year to see patients with psychiatric problems, and here we were dressed for the occasion. Next. Yeah. So on the left, Fred is receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Neuro, and these are 2 of his friends from medical school who came to this event. Next. And finally, Fred enjoys food, as most of those who know him. And on the left is his 75th birthday party that I organized. And next. And this is when we were honored by Jean and Francois Dubois in 2008 by this wonderful symposium which they organized. And in the background, many of you who have been at the Neuro have seen this, portrait of the many physicians associated with it. I just want to say that over the years, most of our friends have been part of this epilepsy society, international epilepsy group, and which included Yukio Fukuyama, Jean Icardi, Otahara, Dieter Jans, Victor Jubowitz, Amos Korchin. We have so many friends all over the world that this has been one of the most fantastic parts of this journey. Next, please. And I want to thank everyone for listening, and I want to tell you how much I appreciate that Fred has been chosen as one of the people that you honor. And I appreciate your invitation, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you very much, Eva, for this very interesting and moving, particularly moving tribute to Fred, and to see how so much of Fred's professional life and family life were just one life together, and that made him such a remarkable person for all of us. Thank you. Now I think we will ask for the panelists to say a few words. And if I follow the order of the program there, we have first Dr. Fernando Sandez from Brazil, who was, of course, a fellow of Fred and at the Montreal Neurological Institute for many years. Fernando? You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I will just put up these slides here. Just a second. And okay. I hope you can all see my screen there.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you again. It is a privilege to be here today in this very moving and important tribute to Dr. Enderman. As you know, he was my teacher and mentor, and has been said already by Sun. He was very patient with everybody, including the fellows who were, like me, a little bit slow to progress over time. And I saw him doing that to all the fellows that I had the pleasure to work with and to be friends with during my 7 years at the MNI. It was very exciting to see his work going from pure enlightenment, and I witnessed many of those achievements. So many neurologists throughout the world have had this opportunity to be inspired by him. And I just want to mention one of the Fred's thing was already mentioned about the seizure conference. And I can say that my very first seizure conference, I was just arrived at the MNI. I didn't speak English at all at that time. It was very bad English. And as Sam mentioned, he would start in the seizure conference asking from the more junior to the more senior people. And I didn't know that, of course. And for my surprise, I was the first one. He asked me to give an opinion for a very difficult case. And of course, I was still a little bit dizzy because my first time there, I was so impressed, so many people, so many important people in the room. I remember that time Ted Rasmussen was visiting the seizure conference, And there was Pierre Glour, André Olivier, Fred Enderman, in all those people, and it was very, I was very impressed. So I couldn't speak, so I couldn't give my opinion at that time, and it was as I was having a focal seizure with impaired awareness. I couldn't say a word, so I just froze. But anyway, over the years, I could get that back and I start to speak. So this is a picture taken on the famous mural at the Neuro when Isha got her PhD. She was first supervised by Eva Enderman and then Guy Rouleau, and of course myself there with Fred Enderman. So I will be very brief, just mentioning that really Fred was a true visionary. He could see things that no one has seen before, and the impact of his observation, including towards myself, and I can mention here a little bit of emphasis in neuroimaging. It's impossible to summarize, so I will not try to summarize all of this. But I have to say that he was a man ahead of his time, even in the area when we had only very early CT scans. He was a firm believer that imaging modalities, imaging was important for epilepsy. And many examples, one example perhaps not much mentioned by Singh was the early days of focal cortical dysplasias, where the images did not show, or things were not seen at all. And he was a very firm believer that we could see small focal cortical dysplasias on the imaging. And that is a true genius in terms of master clinician. So, and also mentioned before, he would take everybody to his home. This is his country house. Isia, myself, together with many people, the Metracos and the Endermans, going for a holiday there, even though we were just recently arrived. So I think over the years, I had the privilege to go to many places, many conferences with Fred. He was very generous and always trying to push one of us to be part of the panel, to the speakers. So without this guidance and his support, I think many of us would not be able to get where we are now. And so I'm very thankful. And I thank the previous speakers. Thank you, Eva, for being here. And for the sake of time, I will leave the floor for the others to say more. I could spend the whole day here, but I think I have to be short because of time. Thank you very much for all of you.
Thank you very much, Fernando, for reminding us of these good times. And it did look a little different in these days, but I think many of us got a little more white hair from this time. But it was nice to see these great pictures. I will now ask Dr. Antonio Gambardella, who is also a fellow of Fred at the MNI, and Antonio from Italy.
Hi. Thank you for giving me the possibility to speak. First of all, I wish to thank Dr. Meshram for involving me in this seminar, this event dedicated to Fred Enderman. I have a sincere, profound gratitude and appreciation to him. It has been already said, his influence on me was enormous because Dr. Enderman was an invaluable mentor who had the extraordinary teaching strategy. And as I got to know him, I discovered that he was really insightful. Always offered me good advice. And I want to share with you just a few pictures. Okay. Do you see the slide? No?
No, we can't see.
No, we can't see, sir.
Sorry?
We can't see your slide.
Click on the share the screen. share screen button.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. Okay. Do you see now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we can see.
Yes, we can see it now.
Fernando already said Dr. Enderman was also pushed me, and I really appreciated him because every time I have the possibility to discuss with him about patients, and he was always insightful. And here you can see that when we organized this meeting in Italy, in my place in Calabria, southern Italy, and it was very happy to contribute, and he pushed me, and as already Fernando said, he collaborated and to plan everything and to involve also other speakers, eminent speakers, Dr. Eva, Sam, Fernando, and many others. And perhaps a thing that has not been said, he was also a sophisticated intellectual who had a broad culture, and he was able to discuss a wide range of subjects. Here we were in a place in ancient museum, that Greek Latin museum that is about Magna Graecia, in the place where I live, and he was, and anytime he was able to talk and discuss about the classic ancient Greek tragedies. Also during a nice trip that we have in Sicily. Anytime he came in Italy, he almost always called me to visit him and to enjoy, to share some moments together. And we went in Sicily, and perhaps Dr. Eva very well reminded this trip in Sicily, where we went to visit the Greek theater of Syracuse, and I was impressed how he was enjoyed the breathtaking scenario and the mystical atmosphere of the Stone theater. But he joined this aspect, cultural aspect, with the scientific aspects, because he wanted to about this meeting in Italy, in my place, and he wanted to make, as usual for him, to make some publication, some scientific manuscript. So he joined this scientific aspect with also more the aspect of this good entertaining, with a good sense of humor and irony. Here you can see this moment of relax. As Dr. Eva said, Dr. Enderman loved a lot of food, especially Italian food, and he always told me about the different tastes that he could appreciate here in Italy, in the different places. And down you can see the other photos with our eminent colleagues, Sam, Fernando, when we organized this meeting in Italy. And so I conclude with this my brief talk, addressing how much was his influence on me, and I feel without him I could reach the actual position, because he taught me how to write a paper and how to approach to the patients. So it is always in my daily activity. Thank you to Dr. Enderman, to everybody, and to inviting me in this nice event.
Thank you, Antonio. It's very nice to be able to bring out, I think, an important aspect of Fred, which maybe was not mentioned, was his extremely wide knowledge and culture of things outside of neurology and outside of it. You had the feeling you can talk with Fred about so many things, and he knew so many things outside of medicine. He talked about the animal kingdom, but the cultural kingdom was also very familiar. Thank you. Thank you very much, Antonio. And now I will talk on I will call on Dr. François Dubois from the Montreal Neurological Institute, who was, of course, a fellow of Fred for many years, and then took on and the mantle of epilepsy at the Montreal Neurological Institute after Fred, and has been a long-time colleague and collaborator of Fred, of course, but of me as well. We worked for so many years together. François.
Thank you, Jean. You hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first, I would like again to thank Dr. Mishram for this kind invitation. I think that this meeting, this initiative is mostly important and I think appropriate. I will first start by saying that I don't have slides.
I'm sorry, François. Ask if you can be made full screen, because we still see Antonio.
How do I push?
No, I don't think it's you. I think it's the. I don't think it's me either.
Mansi, can you put Professor?
Yes, just doing that. Just doing that.
Is it? No, not yet.
No, not yet. We see Antonio.
Well, we're the same people. You have glasses, less hair.
Well, Antonio doesn't have much white hair. It's quite remarkable.
No, that's true. Maybe he put dyes on it. I don't know. Do you want to?
Well,
I'm waiting.
maybe,
or?
I can try to leave and go. I leave, perhaps. I don't know. I stopped it to share the screen.
No, it has nothing
But the host
to do
will do. She will do it now.
I leave. Perhaps I can try to leave and.
No.
No, I don't think so. I don't think it's for you.
No, yes, Aliya.
I guess you have to start to talk, Francois. Maybe.
I can talk. Well, again, as I was saying, I was starting to say, I would like to thank Dr. Mishram for this invitation, this very kind invitation, and this for mostly appropriate initiative. As Jean said, Fred Enderman was a teacher and a colleague for over 30 years for me, and that's for me, it had an impact on my life, on my work. That is absolutely, I would not say that no one else had that, but I'm one of the few that had this privilege. Now, I don't have any slides, so what you're going to see in the background is the ceiling of my basement. And what I would like to do is to indeed share some of my personal feelings about Fred Enderman. First, I used to call him Dr. Fred, and I never, well, very rarely call him Fred. And Dr. Enderman, well, this was initially when I started my fellowship in 1985, almost at the same time as Sam Berkovic. And so I'm of the same generation and with the same white hair. As at the beginning, I spent 2 or 3 years as a fellow at the 3 years as a fellow at the Neuro. And we already talked about this famous seizure conference. I would like just to say one thing about the seizure conference. I was terrorized. I was terrorized, like what maybe Fernando said, even if I was speaking a little bit better English, it was absolutely terrifying to go there. There was all these major people, players, that were listening to young kids like us, trying to shape our mind and trying to say something intelligent, or at least, quite to it, some kind of intelligent things. I remember trying to hide behind the people who was sitting in front of me to avoid to be pointed by Fred to say, "Bon, what do you think, Dr. Dubois?" Now, this was the first most important experience of communication, I think. It helped us. It was absolutely a giftful things that he did for us. It helped us to shape our mind, to avoid maybe to be shy, to go over the difficulty of talking to people, and then from there, shaping our mind, coming with a nice logical process, and hopefully trying to give some kind of input or successful input to the the discussion that we had during those seizure conference. And for sure, I think that just for that, I would thank Dr. Fred Enderman forever. Then I had this, I mean, we're not many, we're just few of us, Jean, Dr. Enderman, Eva, and others who had the career or had the chance to work with Fred throughout all those years. I share 30 years of work, clinical works with Fred. And during all these years, he was absolutely respectful for me. I was a young man, not as maybe imaginative or I don't know, maybe skillful than he would be, but he helped me to shape me or to help me having a good career. I would say a good clinical career. I also did other few things, but from the clinical side, I think that most of my qualities, if you wish, of what I finally achieved was because of Fred told me or showed me. And I think that now I'm dealing with still a lot of difficult to treat or difficult to treat patients with bad epilepsies, with what we call, let's say, catastrophic epilepsies. And if I can deal with those people, even if I cannot always provide a perfect or a good answer, I again deserve that, or I thank Fred for that, because I learned with him how to listen to the people, these patients, to listen their relatives, and to listen on all the problems that are related to these difficult cases. And maybe sometime having indeed some kind of solution, at least an appropriate solution to help these people. And again, for this reason, I would like to thank Fred very much for that achievement. One thing maybe I also learned with Fred is that now even when I'm in an emergency room, I'm still doing on-call studies, I take a chair and I sit when I talk to patients. Now, I would like to, on behalf of, because I was a fellow and I was one of the child, I think, of Fred Enderman, I would like to thank on behalf of all the fellows like Sam, like Fernando, like Antonio, and like the others that couldn't have the chance to be here, that are known, like André Palmini, like many others that worked with Fred Enderman throughout all these years, either as a fellow and then as collaborators. I would like to thank, and on behalf of them, all the supports, the kindness, the intelligence, the ethical behavior that Fred Enderman always showed to us, the respect he had to us, and how he showed us to deal with with difficult patients. And at the end, well, I am a Canadian neurologist, and I think one thing I would like to say to conclude, and this would be specific for our country, I guess, but I think it's important to say that in the tradition of the epileptology and neurology in Canada, in the tradition of people like Dr. Penfield and others, Rasmussen, Dr. Glore, I think Fred Enderman shaped the distinctiveness of neurology, of the Canadian neurology. He contributed largely to make Canada in the forefront of epileptology and neurology in the world. And I think I would conclude with that. And again, thanks, Dr. Mishram, for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dugo, for this personal account. And I know how often when we talk and we discuss, and you tell me about all the difficult patients and refer to Fred and what Fred would do and what Fred would say. And I think Fred kind of sits above all of us all the time. Even though he's not physically with us, he's very much present in our minds, all of us. So thank you, Francois. I don't know if there are other people who want to say something.
Yeah, I think Professor WFN President, Professor Wolfgang Griswold, would like to say something. Professor Griswold had last year inaugurated.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah. Thank you. I think one can only feel humbled by these accounts of Professor Enderman's life and also his methods and his approach to patients that was so nicely described. And I think it's a wonderful way to bring these techniques and to bring this world to us, to the next generations. I was looking up into Professor Aldi's book on neurology and the history of the World Federation. And I just want to remind that he was giving a lecture at the 18th World Congress in London and on an epilepsy topic. And also I think it was very meritful in the previous research groups, which are the predecessors of the specialty groups, the research group on neurogenetics that was chaired by Mrs. Enderman for some time. And I think this was a pioneer work that cannot be estimated enough. At this time, it was maybe a smaller group, but now it's completely reverse. It's a large group of genetics. I also want to thank again Professor Meshram and his team for putting this together and getting us these very interesting insights with personal relations and also personal impressions that make the human beings more human and more tangible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gisol. Professor Steve Lewis, trustee and acting secretary. Yes, Steve.
Thank you, Professor Meshram. I just want to thank you for putting this together, to the Indian Academy of Neurology, and to all the speakers for this, on behalf of the WFN, for this insightful, inspiring, and truly heartfelt tribute to Professor Enderman. Thank you so much. Wonderful.
Thank you, Professor Marco.
Thank you very much, Meshram. I had the opportunity to meet Professor Fred Enderman when I was first training with Professor Roger Charlotte Dravet at the School of Marseille. Professor Joseph Roger was a very close friend of Professor Fred Enderman. They were sharing several subjects such as the progressive myoclonic epilepsies. During the time I was meeting him at different levels, the ILAE, and I believe that the most important contribution, in my opinion, is the way that he educated a lot of people around the world. And I think that they are like his sons around the world, and they are spreading this methodology that we can name Enderman methodology. So we are missing him, but we are still having people that can provide the same way to other people, educate other people around the world. So thank you very much, and we are very pleased from our commission, our specialty group, and from the WFM to have the opportunity to honor Professor Fred Enderman.
Thank you, Professor Marco. Professor Pravina Shah.
I was fortunate to spend about a week at MNI and have a very fond memories to spend time with Eva and Fred. I also remember that Eva and Fred, when they came to Bombay, they visited our E-Cell, a Samman office, and had a good time with our patients. Thank you very much, Meshram, for giving me an opportunity. I really appreciate them a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, madam. And we have Mark Enderman. Would you like to say something, Mark?
Hi, I just wanted to thank all the speakers for extremely thoughtful and heartfelt comments on my father. And we all, as a family, I'd like to say, really appreciate you making this effort, and thank you to the organizers as well.
Thank you, Mark. I think we are at the end of the session. I would like to thank everyone, Professor, especially, I would like to, Professor Guy Trulan's not there today, but he's the one Professor Gee, I had contacted him, and then for quite some time we were trying to hold this session, but then he said that I want Professor Sam Berkovic to speak, and Sam was fortunately that time in Montreal. He said, would you like to speak to Sam? He's here in Montreal. And then we could rope in Sam, and then with his consultation with him, we could get the different faculties from different corners of the world. And I think Professor Sam and Professor Eva did a wonderful job taking us through the life of this very inspiring person. And I don't think there is anything in epilepsy which is, not seen by Professor Fred and not described by Professor Fred. So it's wonderful to have this session going together. And I'd like to thank invited panelists, Professor Fernando, Professor Francois, and Professor Antonio. And would like to thank President of Indian Academy of Neurology, Dr. Nirmal Surya, President-elect Dr. Gagandeep Singh, past President J.M. Murthy for being with us. And I would like to mention that Professor Frank Griswold, WFN President, and Professor Steve Lewis has attended all the previous sessions, previous 9 sessions. This is the 10th one. And they have been with us and supporting this activity very much. So thank you very much. And thank you, Pravina Shah, Mark, and all the participants. This program, many people are also live on the YouTube. This program is simultaneously streamed on YouTube, and would like to thank everyone for being with us. And next time we will have a session on Professor Jerome Posner, and on 2nd April. So would like to have you all for that particular session. Professor Griswold would like to say something.
Yes, if I may just take the opportunity and thank you again. And may we just say that the World Brain Day this year will be celebrated on the 22nd of July, and the topic will be brain health for all. So it's just gone out on the website yesterday, and we will be preparing that. And for all of you and for the regions, it may be a very important occasion to raise the awareness of neurology by this World Brain Day. I want to give this message to you because you're all very important multiplicators as leaders in neurology. And I would thank you if you would be promoting our World Brain Day, which is in the back. It's the 22nd of July. Thank you, Meshram, for letting me say that.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you very much. I would like to thank once again for a wonderful and a great session. It was truly inspiring, and soon it will go on the WFN website. And thank you all. And we'll see you again on 2nd April. Thank you so much. I think we had a wonderful session.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor John, for wonderfully chairing the session and, taking us through the life. Thank you very much. It was really wonderful. Thank you, Eva.
I thank you very much.
I think
really,
you have touched all the personal aspects of Professor Fred, and it's such a wonderful personality, and you must be feeling very fortunate to be his better half for the so many years. He was not only a neurologist but a great human being and a family person, really.
Yes, well, I think that we have met. I didn't know whether we have or not, but you're doing this series. I think is really a wonderful thing. I think it's a great project, and I wish you a great. I didn't know about it. I should really, become more involved. And I was thinking about your name of your group of geographical neurology.
Yeah.
Because I'm very interested in that, because we've been studying these population groups.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have time to talk now, but I was
I have the time.
Yeah. We've been studying these interesting population groups, and there's a one group in Newfoundland, which is just an island of 500,000 people, where there's a concentration of these neuronal ceroid lipofuscinoses. And we thought it was because it's a small island and, so that they all have the same gene. But as the molecular information became available after many years, it turned out that they have all different kinds of genes, but for the same clinical problem, the neuronal ceroid lipofuscinosis, but some are infantile, some are late infantile, juvenile, adult, and they're all due to different genes. And even the ones that are due to the same gene have different mutations on the same island. Yeah. So we really, I think that this is, and I found this also in the same disease in Italy, that two different genes, but for the same clinical problem, within 10 kilometers of one another. And this is something that Sam and I have discussed. He can't think of a solution. He thinks it's, maybe it's chance, but it can't be chance that, a totally disproportionate number of these genetic diseases occurring in one geographical location, but with different genes and different mutations. I thought about this a lot, and I really don't have a solution, but I think since you're the geographical neurology, we should have maybe a symposium on this, or to maybe for the world, for the meeting next year.
Yeah, next year we have a meeting in Montreal.
Has the program been finalized yet? I think I'll talk to Guy and see, because this is something but I think that your committee, or what is it called now? It's not a research group anymore.
Yeah, it's called the specialty group.
Specialty group. Yeah. Okay, I think that would fit in very well with and there may be many other diseases which I'm not aware of, which have the same geographical findings.
Yeah.
Now, what in your specialty group, what does the geographical neurology indicate? I mean, what?
Yeah, basically initially it was called as tropical neurology. And then we thought that these tropical diseases are not limited only to the tropical countries.
Yes, yes.
They spread over to different countries. Now the world has become small. And therefore, rather than only keeping it tropical, then Professor Raj Shakir said that it should be called as tropical and geographical, so that we involve other regions also with similar problems.
But largely it was on an infectious basis.
Yeah. So we had a series initially of neuroinfections of 8 lectures. Then it went on very well. It was very successful. Then I had another series of additional 8 lectures. And then after that, so total 16 talks on neuroinfection. All are there on the WFN website. And then after that, I started this series of inspiring people in neurosciences, and it is people are enjoying it and learning so much from this series.
You were when I saw this geographical, I thought, well, maybe this group can resolve this problem, because that you have genes for something which shows the same pathological and clinical features, but totally different genes, concentrating in one one geographic area. It seems very unusual. So
we have we have more of hot water epilepsy with genetic identification, which is localized mostly to some part of India, especially South India, Bangalore and other things. So,
and I'm sorry about that I didn't send you that slide, because I didn't have my CD. My secretary used to have it.
We got in time.
So I'm sorry that it was very last minute. And it's just because I just got back from the country 2 or 3 days ago.
I know.
So thank you. It was really, I think it was marvelous. I think it couldn't have been better. Now, is Dr. Tandon, he's okay? It was just
Tandon is okay, but then today being a Saturday, he had some problems connecting with the net, and his office was not there. So he conveyed his regards to you, and he wanted to send his biography to you, and
I would love to have it, with his signature and everything. I would love to have it. I only found out about it when I was, trying to look him up to see, whether he was okay, because I didn't hear from him for quite a long time. But I'm going to contact him now. Thank you again. Thank you for everything.
Shall I end the session, sir?
Thank you, Mansi.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Pleasure always.
Yeah.